Hello and welcome. My name is Dr Finian Fallon. I'm a psychologist and psychotherapist here in Dublin. In this session I'll be discussing the COVID crisis and how it might affect frontline policing with Mark Smyth, who is President of the Psychological Society of Ireland and has a keen interest in policing matters. Thank you. So Mark, you're very welcome. Thanks for joining me today. So the focus of our discussion is on frontline policing in Ireland at the moment during the pandemic crisis. I know you have an interest in policing, but I have a few questions that we might go through and see if we might be able to help some of the frontline members with some of the issues that they might be coming up with. What kind of priorities do you see for frontline Gardaí in relation to their mental health at the moment?
I think for me the priority is very similar to everybody else in the population. It's survival, staying safe, getting through the shifts on a day-to-day basis and coming home safe to their families and loved ones. That has to be the priority. I think Gardaí have always had to deal with the stress of leaving home every day and thinking, am I going to be assaulted? Am I going to be safe? Am I going to be hurt? COVID-19 has brought a new dimension into this, so not only do I have to keep myself physically safe, but I could potentially contract a life-threatening illness that not only I would have to deal with, but I have to deal with the additional anxiety of bringing home to friends, family, and loved ones. So that's an additional stressor that's going to be new to a lot of Gardaí. That's going to put a lot of pressure and stress on their mental health.
Do you think, do you have any particular tips or tricks or recommendations for Gardaí in relation to managing that aspect? Like, I know some people feel terrified going into work, and to some extent that's normal for some people at the moment. But do you have any particular ideas or tips that might help people?
So I think it's not only now about how a person manages the day-to-day existences, but also how they plan for this for the longer term, because we don't know how long this is going to go on and how people are going to sustain themselves. So one strategy that people can use is something called radical acceptance. And essentially what that is accepting that it is what it is, that not trying to deny our current reality. Radical acceptance isn't liking something, but it's accepting that there are certain things that are beyond our control. So what's really important is that we focus on what we can do and what is within our control on a day-to-day basis. So with these new kind of shift patterns, with the units getting changed around, everything else has changed. So when the rest days come around, to plan ahead and to think, how am I going to use those best? So the instinct might be I'm just going to sleep it all off, or I'm just going to see what happens. But de-stressing from a situation takes planning, it takes work and time and effort. So we need to think about kind of 4 key things that we're going to do that will sustain our well-being. So sleep, we do need to get some of that. We need to be looking at our appetite and what we're eating and drinking. We need to be getting some exercise when we can, and we need to be maintaining social contact. And I think social contact outside of the job is important, to be able to talk about something else rather than the realities of what you've been dealing with for the last 4 days and what you're going to be dealing with when you're back on shift again. So if we focus on getting those core things right, that will sustain us through most of this.
I like that idea, the acceptance aspect of it, because I think people often confuse acceptance. I was speaking about this in one of the other videos I've done for frontline workers. People confuse acceptance with giving up. It's not the same thing at all. It's a radical, as you say, acceptance of the reality for the moment and doing our best in response to that, but it doesn't equate to giving up. I often talk about letting these experiences wash through our body rather than resisting, because as you know, it actually can cause a lot of stress and tension for people by holding back their feelings during difficult times. There's a huge variation in the types of work that Gardaí are doing, particularly at the moment. There's a lot of community contact going on with older people and vulnerable people who may be self-isolating, which are kind of low stress, to some extent relatively low stress encounters, right across the range to various serious incidents and aggression on the streets and that kind of thing. I'm often interested in how guards might manage the cycling between those two states, the highly aroused, if you like, state of fight or flight, and then the more calm, sort of discretionary sort of interactions they have with people. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. My own kind of beliefs around that is that perhaps actually COVID-19 could be a positive around that right now. In the day-to-day kind of policing environment, certainly in the city centre locations, there's going to be a relatively short scaling between when something could go from nice and calm to something that could be quite stressful. Whereas now, we know that crime rates are down across the board. Yes, significant instances are occurring, but they're much less frequent. I think the other thing that potentially could be a positive around that is that Gardaí are getting the opportunity to interact with the public a lot more. It's certainly a lot more positive. They're showing that it's beyond a policing, it's a community policing effort, reaching out to those elderly people, and to showing, the human side of policing. So I think actually COVID-19, in terms of that connection with the community, that sense of connection, could actually turn out to be a positive.
Yeah, I like in some of the research they talk about the guardian versus the warrior policeman or woman, and I think in Ireland we have a very discretionary police force in terms of how they administer the law, and I think there's a renewed appreciation amongst people, including myself as a member of the public, for that kind of discretion and charm and grace that so many of our police operate in. But can that have an impact on stress levels as well? Do you think that kind of discretionary kind of process, or what do you think of that?
I think the absence of discretion would have the potential to cause more stress for Gardaí. They've always had that freedom, I suppose, to be able to use discretion. I think when you've got a system that insists on a rigid application of a particular set of rules, or in this particular situation, the law, it takes out the context, it takes out the human element. And I think what our Gardaí are very good at doing is seeing the human element, seeing the context, and applying discretion in the greater good and the greater interest. I think if that wasn't there, I think I would be worried more about the potential for increased stress on the guards.
Yeah. One of the things we often talk about in our work, Mark, in relation to sort of the therapists and practitioners and psychologists in their work is what we call compassion fatigue. Another name for that, as you know, is burnout. I suppose it happens very often in relation to in police settings where people, the stress of the organisation, the stress of the organisational pressures are often much greater than the actual day-to-day on the street pressures, as we know from studies that have been done with that. Can you talk to us a bit about the risks of burnout and how to cope and how to avoid those kind of things among police?
I think it's similar for most people, but again, it's back to something we talked about earlier on about planning ahead for your rest days, about how am I going to use those to get away from the job, to get away from stresses, to plan for what I'm going to do, what I'm going to enjoy, who am I going to talk to, is there an activity that I can do. But it's also important to self-monitor for when we might be experiencing burnout. So if we're really struggling to sleep, if we're not eating as regularly or as well as we would have done, if we're snapping at friends and colleagues, where our emotions are feeling like they're on edge all the time. So if we can catch the signs of burnout nice and early and identify what it is, then we can take steps to plan for how we're going to be more compassionate with ourselves and plan for how we can de-stress. So self-monitoring is important.
And I think having a bit of fun as well in the gaps, as it were, is very important. One of the things we've been talking about is the use of gallows humour or dark humour, which I know again from some of the studies that have been done, there's a mixed bag of outcomes in relation to it. I think some science studies I've seen suggested it can be supportive of a kind of developing camaraderie among police. What's your views on this kind of gallows humour and dark humour that can sometimes be present in frontline workers?
I think it's inevitable. It's a coping mechanism. It's a manner and means of managing distress in the situation. And my own view is whatever gets you through it is good enough in that moment to survive the traumas that Gardaí have to endure. And we see that from dealing with the aftermath of a suicide to a serious road traffic collision, from domestic violence incidents, from child abuse. And that is quite prevalent at the moment because people are quite isolated, people are drinking more, and Gardaí, they're trained to be police officers, to be guardians of the peace, but also on a day-to-day basis they're expected to be social workers and psychologists. So they get called to a home where there's domestic violence, and there is increases in that at the moment. They have to be all things, and in the aftermath of dealing with that trauma, if gallows humour gets them through it in the moment, then I think that's okay. One thing I would say just to be wary of is that how others might interpret gallows humour if it's continued to be used, because we know that there is a tendency, not just in Ireland but worldwide, with police forces to repress emotions, not to talk about them, to deny their existence. And in the moment, gallows humour is fair enough, it gets you through it, but long term, I'm not sure how useful it is to use it as a means to deflect away from what you're really feeling. So yeah. I think it's a temporary measure, and it's helpful, as you said, it gets that sense of camaraderie that we're all in this together and we'll find a way through it. But it is important as well to find time to discuss the realities of the emotional experience of what you've gone through in all of these situations, be that from a crisis event like a suicide or an RTA, or just the chronic, perhaps even the boredom of standing at a checkpoint for hours on end, or on a post where irritation levels are going up. So whatever the particular emotion that's triggered by the events that you've had on your shift, to still have some space or way that you can talk about that openly and honestly.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about that, because again, I've thought about this idea again. Sometimes the expression of emotionality is often linked with post-traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic stress, and it seems to me that like we need to contain ourselves during a crisis emotionally, if you know what I mean. But when things are safe and when we can access safety, even it's not going to be possible to access it all the time, but when we can access safety, then maybe that's the time to talk about or explore emotions. But yeah, I think it is a containing thing, but it can also, as you say, it can continue and prolong, and also it can also separate and differentiate guards and frontline workers from their friends and families if it becomes kind of a normal, natural, every time response to these situations. Absolutely, yeah. Um, are there? Would you like to talk about, Mark, sort of 3, 4, or 5 practical day-to-day recommendations that you would have for members of police forces in terms of their self-care or minding themselves every day?
I think it touches back on some of the things that we've talked about already, about making sure that we get the basics right. We look at the things that are the foundation that allow us to maintain our well-being and maintain our safety. So that is trying to get your 8-9 hours sleep when you can. That is sometimes difficult for people. If someone's coming off a night shift, going to bed at 7 a.m. and they've got kids at home who are starting to wake up at that time, it's difficult to do that. And there might be a tendency of, I want to spend time with my kids, and I wake up for sleep. But you do need to try and kind of prioritize that when you can, because sooner rather than later that shift, that tour is going to turn around again, and you're back on the front line. So trying to get that as much as you can.
Yeah.
With the exercise that we spoke about earlier on, yes, opportunities to go out and that and keep yourself fit and healthy, but also maybe to do that with friends and family safely if you can, to exercise in the garden, to do an online class together exercise-wise, to get that social connection with others. Yeah. And that is important, I think, to maintain that social connection through others, and perhaps maybe outside of the job, so that the conversations don't always come back to what are we doing, and what shift are we on, and what duty have we got this time. So maintaining that. There is also a risk, I suppose, for everybody, and I think particularly for police forces, to perhaps use alcohol as a means of de-stressing, but also to try and forget and to self-medicate away from whatever particular trauma they might have endured. So understandable, it will help in some occasions, but just to be mindful that it's not going to be a long-term answer to dealing with the stress of everyday life as a guard.
Absolutely. We know in police forces across the world, alcohol is often an issue. Can you talk a bit about the impact of crisis policing on families and close friends of members?
I think crisis policing is difficult because everything is changing. So we have seen social media clips of members of the public challenging Gardaí at checkpoints as to which element of the legislation that they're trying to enforce this. And I think what we've seen is that the Gardaí responded in a calm, measured, and sometimes good-humoured way, but they're in a very difficult position. We saw that as soon as yesterday, where the news disclosed that the new legislation doesn't occur or doesn't apply to anyone travelling from the north. So Gardaí are trying to work with the people, they're trying to work with the legislation, but it's changing at such a rapid pace that's going to be very difficult for them to always know what the right thing to do is. I think also we've seen in other situations when the crisis has developed is that you might have been tipping along, doing your shifts, looking forward to knowing that in April or May I've got the summer holidays planned with the lads or with the family. I have something to look forward to. And when a crisis develops and leave gets cancelled, it's very difficult then to sustain yourself and think, now what have I got to look forward to? So that's particularly difficult. We've got situations where the Gardaí have went from a 5-unit structure to a 4-unit structure, where you had established relationships and then new people come in. So we know in any such situation, when there's a comfort and a predictability with the people around you and new people arrive, that can change the dynamic and shift. But I think despite all of that, what the Gardaí have always shown their willingness and capability of doing is adapting to whatever crisis comes along, whatever situation they're faced with. They adapt. They may not always get it right, but they do the best that they can do in that given situation.
I know, Mark, in Ireland you've been one of the champions of not being a sort of a kind of a blanket criticism of social media, and again we know it can hinder and help people. I suppose one of the things I've been talking about with people is the idea, like the quarantine we're having at the moment, if you like to call it that, is not like we're in the Middle Ages where we can't leave the village and there's someone at the end of the at the end of the bridge with a pike. I mean, social media can be very good for people in staying connection, but also it can generate anxiety if it's used excessively. Can you give us some of your thoughts in relation to social media, particularly in relation to self-care and policemen and women?
I think, like anything, the medium and the potential benefits from it depend on how you use it. So if you've spent an entire shift listening to, talking about the implications of COVID-19, maybe about somebody has passed away, to then go in and if your timeline is covered with more COVID-19 stuff, it's understandably not going to benefit your well-being. So it may be about taking a break from it. It may be seeking out content that you're going to enjoy. Or I think one of the things that really has impressed me has been the overall force's use of their social media accounts, in particular Twitter, where they're posting images every day, multiple times a day, of Gardaí going to the community, going to the elderly, posting humorous sing-song-alongs, getting involved with the community. So I think when you look at the comments that are underneath those, they're almost exclusively positive.
Yeah.
So you would want to think in most of the police forces in the world, when they post things on social media, will they actually get validation? So I think when maybe members start to doubt themselves, are we making much of a difference? Are people respecting and appreciating what we're doing? Having a look at some of the comments actually could be really validating, because people are very appreciative. They're recognizing the impact that Gardaí are having on the ground. They're recognizing the risks they're placing themselves in. And generally, they're thankful. So I think it's perhaps maybe one of those unique situations where going on social media as a member could be validating when you look at the posts, because you're getting that recognition that people appreciate what you're doing.
Yeah, I like that idea. I've actually suggested to some people to start using TikTok, not necessarily to make videos on it, but there's lots of good fun on it, and it can be good to sort of reset our minds and having a bit of fun. I really like that. But also, I suppose, one of the benefits or the mantras, if you like, or one of the sayings or concepts that people in these stressful situations can think about is that they're doing things for the greater good. Like what they are doing is an objective good. There's no doubt about it. I think it's important for policemen and women of the forces to remember that our gratitude as members of public, but also the fact that they are doing good. Is there anything else you'd like to offer or have been thinking about in relation to police activities and their mental health?
Talk, I suppose it's we know that opinion because of what we do, but to reach out, it doesn't have to be a psychologist, it doesn't have to be a counsellor, to a friend, someone that you trust, just to vent, to explore emotions, to distract yourself. The instinct to suppress, to bury the emotions is going to be strong. It's almost a cultural thing with police worldwide, but we know that we're going to need the Gardaí not only now, but when this is over. So sustaining themselves, minding themselves is really, really important, because the Gardaí are going to be in this for the long haul, and talking is one of those things that's going to keep them mentally safe, to keep their well-being okay, and make sure that they're here and that they're around. I think the other thing perhaps is just the recognition of the potential impact on Gardaí who were rushed to the front line from Templemore out of necessity. They've got some fantastic colleagues that have wealth of experience around them, who've been through many different crises, who know what helps, what doesn't help, how to navigate the system. So to also reach out to your colleagues when you're there on shift, learn from their experience, their support. And I've always seen the Gardaí as being obviously one massive, enormous family. And like in any family or any unit, there are going to be tensions, there are going to be different personalities. But the one thing I think that has kept the Gardaí going and will continue to keep them going is that no matter what, the members of your unit will have your back. They will be there to support you. And to have that confidence to know that whatever you're going through, you will have that support, I think will sustain people.
Mark Smyth, thank you very much.
Thank you, Finian.
Thanks again to Mark Smyth, and thank you for listening. I'm Finian Fallon, Dean of City Colleges Dublin. And remember, this will pass, and to never give up. Thank you.